Year 800 AD. While medieval Europe struggled against barbarian invasions, on the other side of the ocean flourished one of the most sophisticated civilizations the world has ever known: the Maya. Brilliant mathematicians, precise astronomers, visionary architects who erected pyramids that touched the clouds. But above all, they were extreme religious devotees. For the Maya, the universe wasn't merely physical. Every stone, every river, every star in the sky, everything pulsed with divine energy. And the gods? The Mayan gods were not benevolent. They were hungry, demanding, thirsty for blood. In Mayan cosmology, the creation of the world had cost the sacrifice of the gods themselves. They spilled their divine blood so that humanity could exist. And now, it was humanity's turn to reciprocate. But there were different types of rituals. Some were simple, offerings of corn, incense, precious feathers. Others were more intense. Priests pierced their tongues and genitals with stingray spines, letting blood drip onto sacred papers that were then burned. And then there were the supreme rituals, those reserved for the most critical moments: prolonged droughts, terrifying eclipses, imminent wars. In these moments, the Maya believed that only the greatest of sacrifices could save the world from collapse. And one of these supreme rituals involved something that, for the Europeans who had arrived centuries later, would be absolutely incomprehensible: the sacred union between life and death, between creation and destruction, between the pleasure of the flesh and the spilling of blood. But how do we know this? How did these stories reach us?
1517. The first Spanish caravels sight the coasts of Yucatan. Francisco Hernández de Córdoba and his men disembark expecting to find primitive savages. What they find leaves them paralyzed with astonishment. Cities of white stone gleaming under the sun, temples that rivaled European cathedrals, and an organized, hierarchical, deeply religious population. But it's when the Spaniards are invited or forced to witness the religious ceremonies that the true shock happens. Chroniclers Diego de Landa, Bernal Díaz del Castillo, and others document in their private diaries scenes that horrify and fascinate them simultaneously. They write about nocturnal ceremonies where hundreds of Maya gathered in the plazas before the pyramids, about dances that began at sunset and continued through the early morning, about women adorned with feathers and jade, their bodies painted with symbols of fertility, moving in ways that, in the words of one scandalized friar, seemed to imitate the conjugal act with clear intention and without shame. And even more disturbing, these same chroniclers describe that some of these ceremonies ended with young people being taken to the top of the pyramids and never descending alive. Diego de Landa, the Franciscan friar responsible for the destruction of countless Mayan codices, wrote in his manuscript Relación de las Cosas de Yucatan passages that were later censored by the Church. Passages that suggested the existence of rituals where fertility and sacrifice intertwined in ways unthinkable for the Catholic mentality. But here's the problem. Many of these accounts were written by men who didn't speak the Mayan language fluently, men who saw everything through the lens of medieval Christianity, men who often needed to justify to the Spanish crown the necessity of conquering and civilizing these peoples. So, what really happened? Where did reality end and the exaggeration begin? To understand this, we need to dive into the most controversial and most censored accounts.
According to the manuscripts that survived, some discovered only in the 20th century in secret Vatican archives, there was a specific ritual dedicated to Ixchel, the Mayan goddess of the moon, fertility, and childbirth. This ritual, according to these controversial documents, took place during lunar eclipses, or in periods of severe drought that threatened the harvests. Let's reconstruct how the Spaniards described this ceremony. And remember, this is based on their interpretation, filtered through the cultural shock and religious prejudice of those who witnessed it. The ceremony began at dusk. The people gathered in the Great Plaza before the main pyramid. Not everyone, only the initiates, the priests, and those chosen to participate. Fires were lit at the 4 cardinal points, each representing one of the Bacabs, the gods who held up the heavens. The air filled with the heavy aroma of copal, the sacred resin that when burned created smoke that supposedly connected the earthly world to the divine. The drums began, slow at first, a beat that imitated the human heart. Thum, thum, thum. Then the priestesses emerged. According to the accounts, they were young women, chosen from childhood to serve the goddess. Their bodies were painted with red and blue pigments, the sacred colors of Mayan duality: red for blood, for life; blue for sacrifice, for the divine. They wore little more than ceremonial belts ornamented with jade and shells. Their breasts were decorated with symbols of the moon, their heads crowned with quetzal feathers that shone emerald green in the torchlight. The Spanish chroniclers, scandalized, described how these women danced in ways that provoked lust and imitated the act of carnal union with explicit movements. One friar wrote, horrified, "They move their hips in a circular and undulating manner like serpents, their hands touching their own bodies in a way that would never be permitted in Christian lands." But for the Maya, none of this was obscene, it was sacred. These dances represented the primordial act of creation, the union between the gods that generated the cosmos, the movement that gave origin to life. As the night progressed, according to these controversial accounts, the ceremony intensified. Other participants joined the dance. Men and women formed pairs, their movements synchronized, their bodies increasingly close. The drums accelerated. Doom, 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 doom. Some Spanish chronicler even wrote in Latin to hide it from non-ecclesiastical eyes that he witnessed acts of carnal union performed openly, without shame, as if they were part of the worship of their false gods. But here we need to pause and question, did this really happen? Or did the Spaniard, completely shocked by the nudity and sensuality of the dances, interpret symbolism as literality? Because in no archaeological record, in no mural painting, in no surviving codex, is there visual evidence of literal sexual acts as part of public rituals. What exists are symbols, dances, representations. But the Spaniards didn't understand Mayan symbols. For them, all of that was simply pagan depravity. And then came the moment everyone feared and expected, the climax of the ritual. According to the most disturbing documents, a young man was chosen. Some versions say a prisoner of war, others speak of a volunteer who considered it a supreme honor, to represent the role of divine consort. He was taken to the top of the pyramid. His garments were removed. His body was painted completely blue, the sacred color of sacrifice. Here, the accounts become confusing and contradictory. Some chroniclers suggest that the young man participated in some rite of union with a principal priestess who represented the goddess Ixchel herself. Others say he simply remained in ritual position, while mantras were chanted and incense was burned around him. What all accounts agree on is what happened next. The supreme priest emerged, dressed in jaguar skin and jade mask. In his hands, a blade of black obsidian, sharp as glass. The young man was laid upon the sacrificial stone. 4 assistants held his arms and legs. And then, the blow. Quick, precise, the knife piercing the chest, cutting through the sternum, reaching the still beating heart. The priest ripped out the heart with his hands. Still beating, still warm, and raised it toward the moon. Blood ran down his arms, dripped onto the stone, descended the pyramid steps like a crimson river. Below, the people screamed, not in horror, but in religious ecstasy. They believed that in that moment, the barrier between the divine and the mortal had been broken, that the goddess had been fed, that the rains would come, that the harvests would be abundant, that life would continue because death had been offered. The Spanish chroniclers, witnessing this, were petrified with horror and revulsion. For them, it was simply ritualistic murder, savagery, barbarism. And when this sacrifice occurred after a ceremony that involved sensual dances, ritual nudity, and fertility symbolism, well, their medieval Catholic minds reached an obvious conclusion for them. These pagans mix lust and death. They practice orgies that end in human sacrifice. They are possessed by demons. And thus was born the legend of the sexual ritual that ended in human sacrifice. But was it true, or was it a distorted interpretation of a deeply spiritual ceremony that was simply beyond European comprehension? The answer may lie in something the Maya themselves left behind.
In the last 100 years, archaeologists and anthropologists have worked tirelessly to separate fact from fiction in colonial accounts. And what they've discovered is fascinating. First, the Maya really did perform human sacrifices. This is undeniable. Hundreds of bodies have been found in sacred cenotes, in temple foundations, in royal tombs. The surviving Mayan codices themselves, the Dresden Codex, the Madrid Codex, clearly show scenes of sacrifice. But second, the relationship between sexuality and religion in Mayan culture was completely different from what Europeans understood. For the Maya, sexuality wasn't sinful, it was sacred. It was part of the divine cycle of creation and renewal. The goddess Ixchel wasn't just the moon goddess, she was the patroness of midwives, pregnant women, weavers. She represented the feminine power to create life, and her rituals involved symbolism deeply linked to fertility. But symbolism is not literality. Modern researchers believe that the sensual dances described by the Spaniards were, in fact, theatrical representations of the creation myth. Just as Christians enact the Passion of Christ, the Maya enacted the stories of their gods. The priestesses who danced weren't behaving in a lustful manner. They were telling a sacred story through movement. Their gestures had specific meanings. This movement represented rain falling. That one represented seed penetrating the earth. Another represented the birth of a child. For the Maya, the human body was a microcosm of the universe, and rituals that involved the body, whether through dance, purification, scarification, or even sacrifice, were forms of communication with the divine. A modern Mayan scholar explained it this way: when my ancestors danced imitating the act of creation, they weren't being sexual in the Western sense, they were being cosmological. They were performing the birth of the universe. And what about the sacrifice? Yes, it happened, and yes, sometimes it occurred after fertility ceremonies, but not in the way the Spaniards described. The sacrificed person wasn't simply killed after an orgy. He was a messenger, someone chosen to carry the people's prayers to the gods. His blood was the vehicle, not the substance of the ritual. And here's something the conquistadors never understood. Many of those sacrificed were volunteers. Yes, you heard that right. In some Mayan city-states, being chosen for sacrifice was considered the greatest possible honor. You weren't dying, you were transcending. Your name would be remembered, your family would receive privileges, and you personally would join the gods in celestial paradise. Of course, not all were volunteers. War prisoners were also sacrificed. But the narrative that the Maya were simply bloodthirsty murderers is incomplete. They were a complex civilization with sophisticated theology, trying to maintain cosmic balance through rituals that for them made perfect sense. But the Spaniards couldn't or wouldn't understand that. For them, it was all barbarism, and everything needed to be destroyed.
July 12, 1562. A date that should be remembered as one of the greatest cultural crimes in human history. Diego de Landa, the Franciscan friar who had spent years studying the Maya, who had learned their language, who had documented their customs, gathered in the Plaza of Mani in Yucatan thousands of Mayan codices, books, entire libraries of knowledge, and ordered them burned. In his own words, "We found a great number of books with these letters, and as they contained nothing but superstitions and lies of the devil, we burned them all." In a single afternoon, centuries of history, science, literature, poetry, astronomy, medicine disappeared in flames. Of the thousands of codices that existed, only 4 survived. 4! And none of them contained complete information about complex religious rituals. Everything we know about secret ceremonies, about initiatory rites, about the deepest aspects of Mayan spirituality comes from second-hand accounts, from Spaniards who didn't understand what they were seeing, who filtered everything through their own beliefs. But the destruction didn't stop with books. Temples were torn down, statues were broken, priests were tortured and killed, and any Maya who tried to maintain the old traditions was punished with extreme severity. The Spanish Inquisition, when it arrived in the Americas, was particularly brutal with anything related to sexuality and religion. Any artifact showing nudity, destroyed. Any mural representing ritual dances, covered with lime. Any manuscript describing fertility ceremonies, burned. The Spaniards had a particular obsession with what they called sins against nature, and rituals that mixed sexual symbolism with religion were, for them, the worst form of heresy. So if a ritual like the one we're discussing really existed, even if it was purely symbolic, all records were deliberately erased. And here's the most tragic part. The Maya themselves, under centuries of colonial domination and Christian indoctrination, were forced to forget their own traditions. Knowledge that had been passed orally from generation to generation for 1,000 years simply was lost. Entire languages were extinguished, rituals were forgotten, and a veil of silence fell over the true nature of Mayan spirituality. Today, when archaeologists find temples in the jungles of Guatemala or Mexico, they find clues, fragments, pieces of a giant puzzle, half-erased murals showing complex ceremonies, altars stained with what chemical analyses confirm is ancient human blood, sculptures of gods in poses suggesting fertility and power. But the context, the complete stories, the theological justifications, lost forever. And it's in this vacuum of information that legends are born, where exaggerated Spanish accounts mix with real archaeological discoveries, where it's impossible to completely separate truth from myth. Which brings us to the question that divides historians to this day. In universities around the world, academics still debate passionately about what really happened in Mayan temples. On one side, we have the skeptics. Researchers like Dr. Mary Miller, Mayan art historian at Yale, argue that the Spaniards systematically misinterpreted or exaggerated what they witnessed. The colonial chroniclers had an agenda, she explains. They needed to justify the conquest. They needed to paint the Maya as savages, so the Spanish crown would continue financing expeditions. Savages who practiced orgies and sacrifices were the perfect argument. According to these researchers, the dances were just that, dances. Ritual theater, religious performance. Nothing more sexual than a modern ballet that represents a love story. And the sacrifices? Yes, they happened, but not as part of a single obscure ritual. They were separate ceremonies with different purposes that the Spaniards perhaps witnessed on different occasions and then confused as a single event. On the other hand, we have more open-minded historians. Researchers like Dr. Simon Martin from the University of Pennsylvania Museum argue that we can't simply dismiss Spanish accounts as pure fantasy. Yes, there was exaggeration, he admits, but these men were, many of them, trained observers, educated priests who knew how to write detailed reports. When multiple chroniclers in different places describe similar ceremonies, perhaps there was something real behind the accounts. These academics point to intriguing archaeological discoveries. Temples dedicated to Chichen with sacrificial altars at the top. Fragmented codices showing fertility goddesses surrounded by symbols of death. Excavations that revealed mortal remains of sacrificed youth buried near ceremonial areas dedicated to procreation deities. Were these elements really connected, or is it just coincidence? And there are also modern Mayan descendants. Communities in Guatemala, Belize, and Mexico that have maintained fragments of oral tradition through centuries of repression. Some contemporary Mayan shamans, when questioned about these ancient rituals, respond with enigmatic phrases. Not everything that seems sexual is sexual. Not everything that seems like death is death. Our ancestors understood that everything is transformation. Others are more direct. Yes, there were ceremonies where life and death met, where creation and destruction danced together. That's not obscene. It's the reality of the universe. But specific details? No one knows anymore. The knowledge was lost. There's also a fascinating theory proposed recently. What if the forbidden ritual was never a public ritual, but a secret ceremony restricted to the highest levels of the priestly hierarchy? We know the Maya had secret societies, esoteric knowledge that wasn't shared with common people, initiatory rituals that happened far from unauthorized eyes. If an extremely controversial ritual really existed, it would make sense that it was kept secret. And when the Spaniards arrived, torturing priests and burning temples, perhaps they obtained fragmented confessions about these secret ceremonies. Confessions that were later written sensationally in accounts sent to Spain. It's possible. Is it probable? Honestly, no one can say for sure. And perhaps that's what makes this whole story so fascinating. We're not talking about something completely invented. There's too much evidence, too many fragments, too many clues for that. But we're also not talking about something we can completely confirm. The destruction was too systematic. Too much time has passed. Too much knowledge was lost. We're in the gray zone of history. where facts and legends intertwine in ways impossible to completely untangle. And it's in this gray zone that our imagination thrives, where mystery lives.
So, did the Mayan sexual ritual that ended in human sacrifice really exist? The honest answer is we don't know, and perhaps we'll never know. What we know for certain is that the Maya were masters of symbolism, that their rituals were infinitely more complex and meaningful than the Spaniards could comprehend. We know that fertility and sacrifice were both central elements of their religion, not as opposites, but as complements, two faces of the same cosmic coin. We know that ritual dances involved representations of the body, of sex, of creation, but as sacred symbols, not as profane acts. And we know that human sacrifices happened frequently for reasons that made perfect sense within Mayan cosmology. If these elements sometimes combined in a single ceremony in the way the chroniclers described, maybe not. Maybe in an intermediate way that our modern mentality can't fully comprehend. But here's something I can say with absolute certainty. At least 95% of what the Maya really believed, practiced, and understood about the universe was deliberately destroyed. Burned in Inquisition fires, buried under Catholic churches built on sacred temples, tortured out of the memory of priests who preferred to die rather than betray their gods, silenced through generations of colonization, enslavement, and forced indoctrination. The forbidden ritual we explored today, it's just a fragment, a small shadow of a vast and sophisticated religious tradition that was systematically erased from the face of the earth. And that perhaps is the true tragedy of this story. Not what the Maya did or didn't do, but the fact that we'll never know the complete truth because history is written by the conquerors, and the conquerors decided that this story didn't deserve to be told. So, when you see the pyramids of Chichen Itza, or Tikal, or Copan, remember, you're not seeing abandoned temples. You're seeing burned libraries, destroyed universities, cathedrals where 1,000 years of knowledge was deliberately exterminated. And the few fragments we have, the controversial accounts, the surviving codices, the archaeological excavations, are like trying to reconstruct an entire encyclopedia from loose pages that survived a fire. We can speculate, we can theorize, we can debate. But the complete truth about what happened on those nights in Yucatan, under the light of the moon and the gaze of stone gods, it's buried with the Maya forever. And perhaps that's exactly how it should be.
But the Mayan story is far from over, because they're not just the past, they're the present. Millions of Mayan descendants live today in Guatemala, Mexico, Belize, Honduras, maintaining languages, traditions, knowledge that survived the attempt at cultural genocide. And archaeologists continue discovering new temples, new codices, new clues about what really happened in the ancient ceremonies. Who knows what else will be revealed in the coming years? What other forbidden rituals are waiting to be unearthed? If this story fascinated you, if you were intrigued, if you felt that chill down your spine imagining these ancient ceremonies, leave a like on this video, seriously. This type of content took immense work to research, script, and produce. Your like helps more people discover these forgotten stories. And tell me in the comments, do you think the ritual really existed the way it was described? Or did the Spaniards exaggerate everything? I want to know your opinion. Share this video with someone who loves history, mystery, or ancient cultures.
let's keep alive the memory of these fascinating civilizations that were almost completely erased. And subscribe to the channel, because this is just the tip of the iceberg. Mayan civilization is full of dark secrets that official history prefers to ignore. Rituals that defy our understanding, practices that were deliberately hidden, knowledge that was burned before we could comprehend it. And it wasn't just the Maya. Aztecs had even more extreme ceremonies, entire festivals dedicated to gods who demanded sacrifices on an industrial scale. Incas performed rituals of mummifying living children on sacred mountains, practices that archaeologists only recently discovered and that still cause ethical debates about whether or not we should study them. And we don't even need to leave the Americas. In medieval Europe, queens and nobles practiced secret rituals with prisoners that would make these Mayan ceremonies seem mild in comparison. In the next video, we're going to explore one of these stories: a European queen, an isolated castle, hundreds of missing young people, and a blood ritual that, when finally discovered, shocked all of Europe and inspired vampire legends that endured to this day. I'm talking about the Blood Countess and what really happened in the dungeons of her castle. This is real history, documented, proven in court, and it's much more disturbing than any Mayan legend. So stay tuned. Turn on notification bell so you don't miss it. Because if you found this story intense, you haven't seen anything yet. Human history is full of shadows, of buried secrets, of truths that were considered too dangerous to be told. But here, on this channel, we're not afraid to explore these shadows. Let's dive together into the forbidden archives, into the censored stories, into the rituals that should have remained forgotten. Thank you for watching until the end. Seriously, this kind of committed audience is what makes it possible to continue bringing this deep and researched content. Until the next exploration in the shadows of history. And remember, not everything that is buried should remain buried.